Okay, let me start with Britain's role in global finance. City of London is not well known in Turkey. However, especially in the 2010s, the city officials developed deep relations with the AKP, the Turkish government. For example, the public-private partnership projects, which are often criticized in Turkey by the opposition parties, were also adopted in the same decade through Britain and City of London. Even the legislation was adopted from Britain. Could you tell us a little about what distinguishes the City of London from other financial centers and the importance of the city for British imperialism?
Yeah, it's a big topic, of course, but one issue you may remember in the middle of the financial crisis, in 2008, there was a lot of discussion about the interest rate swaps and, the huge volume of these. If you looked at how much technically they were involving in terms of, hundreds and even thousands of billions of dollars worth of swaps. Well, the thing which many people missed out is that the legal basis of these interest rate swaps is actually in English law. And this might seem peculiar because not that many swaps were done with people in Britain, but it reflects the quite big power that British influence over finance has had. And this really dates back to historical factors because the growth of the British Empire, especially in the 19th century, but even before, meant that all kinds of commercial maritime transport, insurance, and trading relationships, that a lot of that ended up being dominated by the British. And the British, for example, in an earlier period were, the biggest slave traders. so basically they played a very big role in international commerce, partly due to the, if you like, imperial objectives. So, for example, in the case of India, they more or less closed down the Indian shipbuilding industry and the Indian shipping industry. Indians could build ships, Indians could sail ships and go from port to port. But what the British did in colonial India was prevent a ship docking at a port unless it was a British one. So it essentially more or less closed down a lot of the shipping industry and shipbuilding industry in India. And instead it was dominated by the British. So all of these commercial trade finance, things like this, and insurance, maritime insurance, Lloyd's of London is, I think, the biggest maritime insurance company in the world. And of course, it's made up of rich individuals who sign up to be members of Lloyd's. But again, it reflects this historical factor, but a historical factor that continues today. And you get the multiple links that the British have had actually extend much further than the Americans. So, although the US is the biggest economic power, obviously far bigger than Britain, no, but, it's pretty clear. The links on which the financial and commercial transactions could build were very strong in the case of Britain, and actually more widespread than they were for the US. So what happened, which put actually there are two phases. I should step back. One is that in the 19th century, the City of London was a big financial hub for the world economy in finance, as I say, shipping insurance, insurance generally, and trading, commerce, basically. And one historian actually put it quite nicely to say that Britain wasn't really the workshop of the world, it was the warehouse of the world. In other words, lots of goods came in and were reshipped out. So Britain has had a long history of being kind of a trading hub, and the financial relationships were built on the basis of that. So again, on things like maritime insurance, on trade finance and things like this. And this was very important for the British. So you had, despite the fact that the British economy in the 19th century had a deficit in the trading goods, the money it made on insurance and its investment income from all its investments overseas meant that its current account actually was about 5% of GDP. So it had a big deficit on trade, but a huge surplus on investment income and on financial income of various kinds, including insurance. That got hit with the First World War, 1914, 1918, as that damaged world trade, and it meant that Britain was in a weaker economic position. They tried to restore it in the interwar period. Didn't go that well, although they were using the empire as a basis on which to try and do that. And then in the immediate post-war period, the British were in a far weaker economic position, but they ended up using the relationship with the US to continue to boost their financial dimension. So you found that in the immediate post-war period, say in the 1950s, trade finance was mainly done in British sterling, not in US dollars. What also happened, especially through the 1960s, was the growth of the so-called euro markets. And the euro markets were largely based in London. And so, and what was happening was that the City of London was attracting foreign banks to come into London where they could do this kind of dealing. And this was because of the low regulations that there were in City of London, for example. And in the euro markets, there are very different regulations. And the Bank of England and the City of London had far fewer regulations on these things. And so the huge boom in international finance through the euro markets, most of that really occurred in London. And what was happening was that despite the relative weakness of the UK economy, which was never really doing very well in that whole period, British finance was using the US dollar, but acting as a kind of financial trading go-between. So you find that even today, the City of London is the biggest foreign exchange trading center in the world, still, even after Brexit, and certainly even despite the weakness of the British economy. And it's one of the biggest financial derivatives trading areas as well, between banks and their customers, things like interest rate swaps and things like this. So it's one of the biggest of those. And I haven't looked at the data for the last couple of years, but a few years ago I did. And the UK banks in the UK, they're not all British banks, for sure, but banks in the UK had the biggest international connections compared to any other country.
Mhm.
So again, it put a stress on, or sorry, I'm putting a stress on how big the city was, despite the relative weakness of the size of the UK economy, certainly compared to the US, but also compared to a number of European countries. I think a lot of the discussion that you find on the internet about this, I think, is just completely wrong.
Mhm.
The City of London has been given all kinds of, if you like, privileges from the point of view of financial regulation, but it's not as if it's some separate power in and of itself. It's been very much a policy pursued by every single government, and especially since the 1970s. There was a deliberate policy by conservative governments and Labour governments to
Mhm.
boost the financial sector, to loosen regulations and
Mhm.
allow a big expansion of the city. It's a deliberate, definite, consistent part of British policy. And the reason is that they make a lot of money from it, or the British economy does, something which, ironically, the Brexit policy has messed up because it has been a dampening factor on the economic benefits of the city. There is generally if you like, a popular opinion that would look upon banks, the city, finance, things like this as being a negative for the domestic economy. Well, in the boom years, so to speak, when everything was looking wonderful, in this ridiculous fashion, equity prices going up, all kinds of financial indicators looking good. Then it was more of a popular opinion against the greed of the bankers, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And of course, even young people, let alone the big executives earning millions of pounds, this sort of thing. That was an easy focus of resentment. Then when the crash occurred, the 2008 financial crisis, the bailing out of banks and things like this, that became a big deal. And, widespread dislike, hatred of the bankers, this kind of thing.
Yeah.
But what none of them could deny was that it was an important factor for the British economy and finance, tax revenues and all this kind of thing. So there's a popular opinion against banking and finance, and it's very common among left-wing radical people. But it's a very simplistic, maybe I shouldn't say it. I think it's a stupid point of view because it ignores how the financial sector is a necessary aspect added on to the way capitalism works. And, as you mentioned, I go through this in my book, and even give an example, say, take Apple, right? Apple, the huge technical wonder company of the US, well, it happens to own one of the biggest bond trading companies, right? You think, oh, well, it's strange. I always thought Apple was, consumer technology, things like this. Well, no, it does a huge amount of, you know, financial derivatives deals. It handles a load of bonds, and it's got a company which is called Brayburn, right? And Brayburn is a type of apple, and it's based in Nevada. And so not many people know about this. They know about iPods and iPhones and Macs and things like this, but they don't really know about Brayburn, right?
Mhm.
And any big company, not simply Apple, any big company has to have a financial arm from the point of view of dealing with foreign exchange risk, interest rate risk, transactions, and everything else, right? So you can't get around that. Every single company does it, even if they're technically an industrial company, a commercial company, or whatever. They have to do it, and it's a necessary, inescapable factor of capitalist markets. So if you don't like finance, but you want capitalist markets, there's a contradiction in your view. These inevitably follow from capitalist markets. So you can't get around that. You need to do something about capitalist markets if you don't like capitalist finance. Otherwise, you're on a loser. There is an honest to goodness, wonderful industrial capitalist, and the evil financial capitalist is a ridiculous way of looking at it. Because of all these necessary links that there are, where you find that, say an oil company like British Petroleum, BP, right?
Yeah.
They will have a big treasury trading department because they're dealing with the ups and downs of oil prices. They're dealing with their cash flows. They're dealing with all kinds of things. So there is a necessary feature, a financial feature of every single big industrial company, right? Technically, they're involved in manufacturing things and whatever else, but they must do these things. What has happened, though, is that most of the world's production is now taking place, especially in Asia, but in a number of countries where wages are relatively low and cost of production are lower. And it then means that the richer countries have focused more upon having a monopoly position in narrower fields of industry, maybe specialist engineering and things like this, or they get involved in commercial power. So, Apple, to go back to Apple, they will get everyone else to do the production for them, and they depend upon licensing and commercial monopolization in order to generate their huge profits. So they don't produce that much. They get all the production to be done somewhere else, but they still make a huge profit because they do huge markups. So everyone else does the production for them and they do the marking up. And that's an extreme case, but it's similar to what most of the rich capitalist countries do. So you find a reduction of the share of manufacturing and industry generally in all of these countries. And the big growth instead of the services sector. Of course, you need a services sector, right, in an economy. You can't just live off manufacturing or mining or industry. But what has happened is that the commercial power of the rich countries is an important way in which they siphon off value from the rest of the world. It's part of their parasitism on the world economy. And the financial aspect is an important part of that. So this commercial parasitism and financial parasitism is an important part of the infrastructure, if you like, of the rich powers who run the world economy.
Let's talk about some Brexit debate, and also related with this topic. With Brexit, some Thatcher-style Tory economists wanted to make the UK a new Singapore, and you harshly criticized this in one of your articles. But don't you think that complaints about bureaucracy in the EU, Brussels' attempts to regulate financial institutions, and Tories' criticism of moving away from the free market, etc., signify a bifurcation with continental capitalist institutions and ideas?
Well, there's always been a problem for the British, because for a long period of time, it looked as if the main growth area of the world economy was Europe, effectively. Not anymore, but it was for a while. And so you had the growth of the European economy and, the EU, and there's a big debate in Britain about whether to join it. And through the 1960s, the British had a lot of internal debate. Should we join it? Should we not join it? And they saw that the previous empire links were not doing them much good in economic terms. So basically, it looked like, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, these European countries were growing. Maybe we should get involved in them instead. The problem is, if the British did that, then would they still have a dominant position? That was always the issue. And that was always the calculation that they had to make. In the early 1970s, they finally decided, yes, we need to do it. So they joined the European Economic Community. It made a lot of sense for them economically, but they were using then the link with the other Europeans to put economic pressure on their own declining industries and try to build up and, if you like, have a competitive whip to reform them and get them in better shape. Whereas they had previously had strong links in with the former empire, the so-called Commonwealth, which gave them a privileged position, but it meant that they were no longer that competitive in the rest of the world. So the Conservative government of the early 1970s, and then followed through by the Labour governments afterwards, tried to make the British economy more competitive, and therefore be able to compete a bit more also with the Europeans. The thing is, though, they had a big problem of how do you maintain a dominant position when you're no longer that dominant economically, even in the European context. And they were very concerned about losing political power. And so that was why they didn't want to join. They joined the EU, or the European Union, but they didn't want to join the new setup of setting up a single currency and having the euro, because that would be a step too far and would mean that they would lose influence. So they didn't like doing that. And they also feared that it would undermine the position of the city and instead give more direct power to, say, Germany and the European Central Bank and all these sorts of things. So they didn't like it, and they wanted to step back from doing that. And there's always been that tension, wanting to have links. And actually, the City of London was doing most of the euro-related business in Europe. Mm-hmm. And the Europeans didn't like it that much, because the size of, say, Frankfurt or Paris as an alternative financial center, they were relatively poor at doing that compared to the size and power of the British financial system in dealing with, European finance. Doing Brexit was a very stupid economic idea, completely stupid, right? Except for a couple of narrower dimensions of, and this is why you found that big companies didn't make a big deal about Brexit because half of the population, a little bit over, were in favor of Brexit. So they didn't want to make a big deal about it and annoy half of their customers, right? So they didn't really want to talk about it that much. But the only people really in favor of Brexit among, say, the financial sector or business were either, hedge funds and venture capitalists, people like this, who thought that they could make use of, fewer regulations, lower wages, and all this kind of thing. But so they had a more Brexit orientated point of view, and they also appealed to a more nationalistic version, which frankly a lot of the British working class were in favor of. So it was British nationalism against a so-called European power that they didn't like, and we will be free of, and we can do separate things and all this kind of stuff. It was a pretty stupid nationalistic view that actually was undermining the social welfare aspects of the British working class. But the British working class, on the whole, were in favor of this nationalistic, anti-Europe perspective. I'm not saying that the Europeans were wonderful progressives and this was a negative thing to do from that perspective, but it was a bit of a dumb move, certainly economically, and instead opened up a more reactionary perspective that could be implemented by whichever government, and in that case, more the Conservative government than the Labour government, if you like. Because the trade unions, for example, were, on the whole, a bit more pro-European because they saw more positive social welfare things happening in Europe than were likely to happen outside of Europe, outside of the EU. So that was the reality. And it was an anti-immigration thing against these EU migrants undermining our living conditions and, trying to get British welfare money and all this kind of stuff. That was the anti-immigration aspect of the populism, anti-Europe stuff, which led to more of an anti-EU perspective on the part of British working class, not everyone, but more of them, which was the fuel for the Brexit view, which also tied in with the anti-EU Nigel Farage type UKIP type perspective. But economically, it's a stupid thing to do. And economically, Brexit was a bad mistake. And, you see the way that the European Union is going. It's hardly progressive. It's also, dominated by the US, and it's doing stupid things. So my position, if you like, was I abstained. I thought the European Union was bad and the British wonderful alternative was also bad. So, I couldn't choose to say one was better than the other. But, to have that view that there was some British wonderful alternative was obviously ridiculous. British were looking for more positive economic growth, if you like, from Asia, whereas the European dimension of growth looked pretty weak by comparison. But they also feared growing Asian economic power. So it was a bit of a mixed kind of point of view. So yes, for a while, they wanted to build up more kind of Asian relationships in economics, but they were also afraid of a bigger China dimension, and then easily bought into the American paranoia about China. So it has always weakened how far the British angle could really buy into an Asian perspective. So, you know, they basically wanted to be involved with Asia, but as long as it would keep Western power that they had a big role in, as long as it could keep that Western power in place. So that was the angle that they tried to push. So, you know, it led to this ridiculous, you know, Singapore on Thames alternative, which has gone nowhere and looks stupid. But the British are left in the middle of nowhere, frankly, in that respect. You know, they're not powerful enough to exert some kind of independent view. They're number 2 or number 3 on the list when it comes to the Americans. The Europeans don't like them very much, but they're stuck. They look a bit stupid, frankly, although they will always attempt to boost their, you know, wonderful international. We're not the Americans. We're not as aggressive and imperialistic as the Americans, but they do a lot of what the Americans do.
Today, the European Union also announced new tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. You know,
Oh yeah.
according to reports, Germany, Sweden, and Hungary opposed the new tariffs, while France and Spain, in particular, pushed for new tariffs. So, how realistic do you think Europe's decoupling from China, or de-risking, as it is officially called?
Number one, it can't be done. Number 2, it's an attempt to shore up a quite weak European economy, whether it's the British angle on that or whether it's aspects of the European angle on that. But say many German companies are completely opposed to this idea of decoupling, and decoupling from China cannot be done. Basically, it can't be done. And it's a stupid thing to try and do. And it's not simply China as such. They're worried about Korea, they're worried about India, they're worried about all kinds of things where they can't compete with Asia. Basically, that's the idea. You know, they can't compete with the growing power of the Asian economy. So that's why they want to do these sorts of things, but they can't compete. Basically, that's it. And they'll choose China in particular because China's the big growing economy, the big, more powerful, competitive economy. So they'll pretend that Huawei has all these evil spying things going on, whereas the wonderful Google, the wonderful Amazon, and all that kind of stuff doesn't do quite the spying that the Chinese do. It's ridiculous, ridiculous. And they just want their more Western American-based power, which is not, which is an independent power that they don't like. Many African countries, for example, choose China as a more progressive, alternative, productive alternative to Western domination. That's it. And it works for them, right? Who's going to build them? Bridges, roads, railways, power stations, etc. The damn British and the Europeans and the Americans are not going to do it. The Chinese are. So it's not a debt trap. And all the debt trap rip-off stuff is rubbish, frankly. And it's been proven not to be true. But they want to argue this, basically. That's it. It doesn't, I'm not pretending that every single Chinese investment is wonderful and every European investment is completely terrible. Yeah, it's not true. But it is rubbish to say there's a Chinese debt trap and there's all the rest of it. There's all kinds of proof that that's rubbish. And they just can't compete, but they're not as controlling of it as they were when it was the Anglo-American perspective on the wonders of Western power. That's the point. And they're worried about losing that. That's basically it. And it's more productive than the Western US Anglo type domination that many Asian countries, Latin American countries, and African countries have been damaged by in previous decades. And they know they have. And it's a good idea to build something different. There are going to be all kinds of conflicts, complaints, and all the rest of it, but it's a more productive alternative than they are offered by the British, the Americans, the Europeans, basically. So it's the way to go, and that's what they're doing in all kinds of ways. So that will continue. The Americans will complain, the British will complain, the Europeans will complain. But it's good that they're trying to build an alternative, productive economy that isn't dominated by the parasitism, the parasites of the Western world, basically. They're trying to get out of that trap, and it's working. It's better for them, and they see that. Every single damn one of them sees that there is now an alternative to this rubbish, and they don't want it anymore. So they're trying to build an alternative. That's it. There might be a mess here and there, whatever. It may not entirely work always, yeah, but build an alternative to that kind of stuff. That's what they need to do. And they're doing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fine.
And,
Okay, please go
and
on.
Turkey and Asia and other countries should sign up for that, not to the Western rubbish that will try and dominate them instead. The British are strong allies, of course, with the Americans. And they see any real challenge to American power as being a problem for them. It's sort of like being, the big deputy that wants to be a wonderful alternative, or not alternative, but having its own stuff, right? And it doesn't entirely work for them, but they can't do anything else. They want to be a bully, but they depend on the Americans. That's the stuff, really. They want to pretend that they've got an alternative, and they don't. But they need to depend upon the Americans to boost their power. So when it comes to Ukraine, they're more anti-Russian than the Americans are, and in the Ukraine stuff, they're more against what the Russians are doing than the Americans are. But it's a policy that will lose because Russia will win. Basically, that's what's going to happen. But they want to boost something else instead because they're worried about losing their power, which is dependent upon the power of the Americans and the West in general. And something else is being built, which is not the Americans and Western power. So they don't like it. That's it. And that's how all of these things should be looked upon. That's the key thing. Anything that happens today is a basis of, is it going to be Western power, mainly American power, and the Brits would like their angle on it, or European power, or whatever, or not? And it's going to be instead an alternative built by other countries. The British don't like it, the Americans don't like it, and they try and pretend how terrible that is. But these other countries are trying to build an alternative that is better, frankly. And that's what they're trying to build.
Yeah, but what about the Middle East relations and ongoing Gaza war in the Middle East, in Palestine?
Well,
and British role about that.
Yeah, the British got a reactionary role about that. They got a terrible role about that. But, there's no way that they will be a progressive force in Palestine, in Gaza, in the Middle East, West Asia, whatever. They will always play a reactionary role. It is now being found out by their policies to back Israel every way, and it depends upon backing the Americans as well. But it's bound to fail. I hope it does. But it's not something that they will ever really back away from or try to do something different. And all of their policies, are reactionary and stupid, and they're gonna fail.
Mm. So you still think that the UK is going to act as a kind of lapdog for the American imperialism around the world?
Yeah, basically, because that's their only option.
Mhm.
They would like to be independent, wonderful alternative, and they don't like it being Americans, the damn Yanks, right? They don't like the Yankees. They want to be something different, but they can't be because they're too weak. So they want a wonderful British stuff instead. The British stuff, though, doesn't do anything for anybody, doesn't build anything, and is no alternative for any other country. So basically, they back the reaction, not alternatives. That's the way it works. So they have to back reaction in the Middle East, in the rest of the world. And that's what they do. I think essentially that the basic idea is that the Europeans are losing. They don't maybe like the Americans that much, and they want to be different from the Americans. But it turns out they're not that different from the Americans.
Mhm.
One of them, they're trying to screw you as well.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. That's the basic idea, what they're doing. So, okay, I'm a Brit, but basically that's what they're doing. And
Hmm.
that's it. So you need to look elsewhere if you want to build something different.